My guest this week is Rear Admiral James Morse, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Rabdan Academy in the United Arab Emirates. A former naval officer who I know from my military time, James had a great 34-year-long career in the Royal Navy, leaving in the rank of Rear Admiral back in 2016. And he then went from there to be in his current role. And in that role, he's responsible for the Academy's provision of world-class higher education, training, research and advice to individuals and organizations in the safety, security, defense, emergency preparedness and crisis management space out in the UAE. It's a fascinating role. It's a new institution when James took up the role. And he's got an amazing pedigree of leadership from his former military career, but also now out involved and very actively involved in a part of the world which is fascinating for all sorts of reasons, and has further developed his leadership skills tremendously as a result of all of that. He'll talk more about his career in detail on the podcast, but I was really keen to get him to talk because I think he brings a whole different set of perspectives, both from a military career that is relatively traditional in UK sense, but also all that additional layer that he gets from what he's done out in the UAE since 2016. And it was a great interview. It was thoroughly enjoyable to talk to him. We know each other from being on the Royal College of Defence Studies together back in 2007. And I hope you enjoy it just as much as I did. So without further ado, I'm Bob Judson. You're listening to Leading for Life Stories. And let's get on with it. So, James, really great to have you on the podcast. Thanks very much indeed for your time. I'm really looking forward to the conversation because you're in a fascinating part of the world, having had an amazing career. So it's going to be great.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to talk to you, Bob, and good to see you after a few years apart.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really lovely to catch up. Just, I think, as a starter, I mean, obviously, I know you very well, but it would be really helpful for all of our listeners if you could just do a relatively short summary of your kind of career to date, beginning to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I come from a long line of Navy people. So in 1982, I joined the Royal Navy. I just finished at school, and I joined as a warfare officer. And then they kindly sent me off to study engineering at university, which was great. And then back to the Navy and into small ships, which was a wonderful education, a sort of small team operational sort of way. Small ship command, and then warfare officers courses, operations officer sort of role, and then to command a frigate, HMS Sutherland, which was fascinating. It was the commanding officer had just been removed from command when I took over. And so there were quite a few interesting moments there, which we might touch on as we go through this chat. From there, I went to the Permanent Joint Headquarters, my first exposure to the world of joint operations, and quite an education, or almost a humiliation of how little I knew about everything else. And then from there, actually, I went back to command a frigate again after they had removed another commanding officer. So for a brief period, I had this reputation. If you were going to take, if you heard I was taking over from you, you knew you were about to be sacked. But I had a quick turnaround there in that ship and went to join HMS Illustrious as the executive officer, the commander. And 9/11 happened actually just as I was on my way there. So got involved in operations at sea, launching operations up into Afghanistan over the land, which was a fascinating thing to be doing. And certainly in comparison to when I joined the Navy in the Cold War was just such a contrast. From there, I went to the Ministry of Defence as the naval assistant to the First Sea Lord, which was also an education. Another thing, I'd never touched the MOD before, and to go in there straight into the outer office role was a big education for me. And then to High Command Staff course off to command HMS Chatham, another frigate, this time a brilliantly run frigate already. And that provides a different set of challenges when something already is running beautifully and what difference you can make to it. From there, I joined you, in fact, on the Royal College of Defence Studies course, which I remember was a great opportunity for us, a real mind-broadening opportunity. It's great to have a time like that where you have a chance to actually think about the bigger issues, because often you're so close to the sort of tactical day-to-day that actually as someone said to me, it was the first time in their career they had time to change their mind. And that's quite a profound statement about how rushed our lives are and how little we get to think about the really big picture stuff. I actually was taken off the course early to go off to be the Director of Force Development in the back of the MOD as a Commodore, and then to command the UK Task Group afterwards. I deployed to the Gulf as Commander Task Force Iraqi Maritime, working under 5th Fleet in Bahrain. And that was a really interesting operational time as the rest of the British forces were pulling out of Iraq. So we were still doing the naval maritime operations in the south of Iraq. From there, I came over to Washington to take over from that job as the Chief of Defence Staff's liaison officer to the Chairman of the Joint Staff in Washington, D.C., which was another eye-opening experience, I think. And on return was promoted to 2-star to become the Commandant of the Joint Services Command and Staff College, and then for a while was also the Director General of the Defence Academy. I went back to the Navy after that to Navy Headquarters, and I had one of those great jobs that got 3 job titles as Chief of Staff of Capability, Chief of Staff of the Headquarters, and the old traditional title of Controller of the Navy, which is a Navy Board post responsible for capability. So I think I was the last official controller of the Navy, because the Navy Board was then reorganized and things were changed around. And at that point, whilst I was in that job, I received an approach over LinkedIn, interestingly, from a headhunter in UAE, saying, was I interested in the role as the president of a new university that had been established in Abu Dhabi called Rabdan Academy. And I read the job description. I actually thought, for the first time I've ever read a job description, I think I'm almost qualified. There were a few areas that I wasn't. And then that caused lots of that soul searching that you do about decisions. But I resigned from the Navy in 2016 and came out to the UAE, to Abu Dhabi, to become the president and CEO of Rabdan Academy.
Yeah, fantastic. Now we're going to come back to the Rabdan Academy for sure in just a second, because I think it's a really interesting entity, and I really want to know a bit more about it. I've always thought, interestingly, you took a lot of your sort of commands in your earlier career as an Air Force officer for a long time, where when we were commanding things, by and large, you were still fairly accessible to the senior leadership. You generally had people either on the base with you, or certainly in pretty close reach to you with what you were doing. But I've always admired Navy officers for the fact that actually you've got pretty young men and women who are in command of ships miles from anything resembling UK control, and having to make some really punchy decisions. I think it's got to be a really, really big growing up opportunity in terms of how that works for all of you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I came out here in 1988 as the navigator of a minesweeper to start with. My first ever job in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war. The tanker wars were on. They were sowing mines through the Straits of Hormuz. And attacking tankers in the Straits of Hormuz, and all up the coast here there were burnt out oil tankers. And it was a real eye-opener. What was interesting between then and today is that today every soldier, sailor and airman has a device whereby they know what's going on around them. They hear the controversy and the politics. They hear much more about the wider context of the war. In those days, we had no idea what was happening much beyond about 10 miles from the ship. And it was only later when I read the history, I actually could work out what we did, what our role was in the operation. It's such a huge shift. I mean, we'll come on to leadership issues, but leadership in those contested political debates just didn't really happen because no one knew what the debate was.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had command of a little patrol boat, and we were rounding. I remember at the age of 26, 27, we were rounding Land's End, and it was very rough. And there was me, I was the only officer, and there was a ship's company of 5 and some young officer cadets. And something broke free on the forecastle, and we had to put someone down there to secure it. And I thought, I better ask someone, who knows how to do this. And of course, realized as I looked around, that was me. I was the one who had to make the decision. And it was, I remember it was a pivotal moment of decision making. I couldn't call anyone. There was no phone a friend. No ask the audience. This was a decision I had to make. And actually, that in your 20s is really helpful when you've got those decisions you have to make about what you do about things as part of the education.
Fascinating. I think, you may have heard, I did a podcast not that long ago, actually, on my own about loneliness of command, and I think in the Navy in particular, with the nature of the way you operate, with the captain obviously not generally dining in the wardroom and being separate from the rest of his or her officers. I think that's a bit fascinating, perhaps, to touch back on that in a while as well, because I think it's a really interesting dynamic that you've got there. Where you really are quite isolated from everyone else. Just before we do that, though, let's come back to Rabdan, because I think, as you say, it was a new institution that you took over. You've been there obviously a while now, and I think it'd be really interesting just to get to know a bit more about what it is, because it's a model that I've kind of touched on, but not had anything directly to do with, and I think it'd be really of interest to everyone else as well.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a fascinating model. It's one of the things that attracted it to me. But it came from the vision of the then Crown Prince, now President, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. And he observed that in the field of safety and security and defense, you need to find a way of getting everyone to work together cooperatively. There's a lot of absolute world-class organizations here, but the challenge is getting them to operate together collaboratively as a single team. And that's often a behavioral thing. And you'll know, because there's a similar debate in virtually all militaries about how you bring people together. But his vision went wider than just the military. This wasn't just joint. This was, how do you bring the police? How do you bring the intelligence agencies and all the other parts of your safety, security, and defense areas? How do you bring them together so that they can cooperate? And so he had this vision that he set, which was to have a university bringing together young people so they train and educate together for their 4-year degree, so that when they go to the military or the police, they're instinctively thinking across government in this field. And I think that was 10 years ago he established the academy. We've now doing master's degree, bachelor's degree, diplomas across a range of fields, from defense and security, police and security, emergency management, business continuity, homeland security, a whole series of fields. We do intelligence analysis, systems engineering for defense. We do a big range of academic programs, but we have an enormous area looking at short courses, vocational short courses, for a whole range of stakeholders here, trying to bring people together, really, build trust, build networks, and create that sort of team spirit. And the university has grown considerably over the 10 years. I've been here 7. I was an executive vice president running it before I arrived. And the team's grown from 100 then to probably 300 plus now. We do consultancy, we're doing research. We're the academic partner for the Zayed Military University, which is another new initiative here, which is bringing together a lot of the young cadets in a sort of Sandhurst model, if one looked at it that way, but they do a degree at the same time. So it's tri-service plus police, male and female cadets training together, and that will expand further over the next few years. But Rabdan Academy is the academic partner, so we offer a defense and security degree there as part of our offering. So yeah, it's a really interesting model, because it's really about trying to change behaviors. You're using training and education as a vehicle to change the behaviors of people so the whole of their career, they are thinking cross-government, and they're much more in tune with each other. They have much more trust. One of the things I always found challenging in the UK was that we tend to spend the first 10 years of our careers at least in single service, and pretty much I did, as you heard. And you come out of it thinking that your service is preeminent, that the other 2 services are stealing all the money, and therefore you get this dreadful competition going on. The one good thing about going to PJHQ, not the one good thing, many good things, but one of them was, in PJHQ, was this focus on winning as a joint force, rather than promoting your single service. But then, of course, you can return to the MOD and find yourself still in the same battles. And so here, trying to get behavior and trust from a very early stage in the career was something that I was really struck by, and one of the real attractions to coming out here to run the academy. So it's been a great journey, and some really talented young people now out in their businesses. So we've got about probably 700 to 800 graduates now employed across the safety, security, and emergency management sectors here in the UAE, already contributing. And of course, it's a long-term project. It's not something you can instantly say, oh, yeah, it's an immediate success, as it were, because if you look at the vision, this is about, as I say, a change of behaviors over a lifetime. And with the hope that you get a much more joined up, integrated, fused approach. You use whichever term you like.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea. And I totally share your view about the sort of frustrations on the UK side. I mean, I think in the latter part of my career, I've finished up doing the last 9 years almost of my career was all joint. I didn't do anything back into the Air Force after I commanded a station. And I did find that quite frustrating occasionally when I went back to my parents' service and we were still having what I viewed were rather kind of myopic arguments on a single service basis, that I just thought this is not that helpful. The reality is the pot of money is the pot of money. It's for defence. It's not for the individual services. And therefore joining up with that, and as you say, joining up across wider government is such a valuable thing. How successful has it been in terms of branching outside the UAE, or is it very much just still a UAE entity and not looking at people from elsewhere coming to the courses, or indeed going from the courses out to other bits of the world?
Yeah, we have started locally. So we've started with Emirati students here. A lot of them are sponsored through by the military or the police or their intelligence agencies, not surprisingly. But we have some academic students now from overseas, from around the GCC, and predominantly from countries to the east of the UAE. We do also do exchanges with Virginia Commonwealth University in the USA, so we send students on exchange there, and they send students to us. And yeah, it's just reflecting on your point there about cross government and behaviours. I keep pointing out to the students that the opponents that we face, and because we're not just in defence, we're looking at organised crime, we're looking at terrorism, counter-terrorism. They don't organise themselves in the same way as us. There's no symmetry in this. There's very entrepreneurial organisations out there with young people facing off against government structures. And of course, what they do is they look to exploit those seams and boundaries between organisations, both from a geographical sense of, but also from a legal jurisdiction. These are clever organisations that know how to exploit jurisdictional boundaries. So if you don't have a whole team approach to security and defence, you are going to expose big seams between your various organisations, which can be exploited. So, I think this is going to get worse. This is going to be a bigger issue in the future than it is now. So we better get better at working as a team. And of course, team goes beyond local. It goes to international as well, international partners. And as you all know, the UAE has been an international partner in quite a lot of military operations recently, but actually with Interpol, with other organisations as well, tries to play this role in the international community and organisations as well.
Yeah, it makes an enormous amount of sense. And as you say, if you leave seams exposed, then they are just exploitation opportunities for bad actors. So the more joined up we can be, the better. And I think the next stage on from that is more international cooperation actually in that space, because that's clearly a weakness at the minute, without a shadow of a doubt, in a world which is organised crime is a great example of that. It's not it doesn't recognise the boundaries and the borders that are there. So and they're actively looking to exploit it. One of the things I do on these podcasts is that obviously the aim is all about leadership, and it's individual leadership and leadership experience. And I'm really keen to understand the motivations of people I talk to about why they do what they do, and in many instances have got to very successful senior levels, just as you have. When you go right back to the beginning, what was it that motivated you, and how did you sort of prepare yourself for what was then a long career in the Navy?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I come from a bit of a line of Navy people. My grandfather fought in World War I and II, so he was at Jutland, and then fought in the Second World War and retired as a Rear Admiral. My father was a Commodore in the Navy. In fact, both of them were anti-submarine warfare officers, TAS officers, as we used to call them in the old days. So I must be probably the only third generation anti-submarine warfare officer probably who served. And what was interesting about it, my father didn't try and persuade me, although it was all around. I think, you talked about your childhood experience and connections, but the Navy was all around me as a child, I guess. My father was away a lot. But he was very clever about it. He never tried to persuade me. And if as a parent, if you're ever trying to get your children to do something, the more you push them, sometimes the less likely they are to do it. But he took me to sea when I was probably about 9. We used to do this sort of, in those days it was fathers and sons. Now, of course, with women at sea, it's families and children. But he took me to sea overnight from Portsmouth to Chatham on the frigate he was in command of. And I remember I was watching him doing his job, and I thought, this is great. He's got a lovely cabin, really comfortable. He has a steward who brings some meals. He sits on the bridge. Everyone comes up and salutes him. And he says, yes, please, carry on, make it so, and all those good naval terms. And I thought, I could do that job. I could sit in a chair and drink tea and tell people to get on with it. Because I slightly missed the point that he'd had quite a few years to get to that position. I just assumed that was sort of you joined to be a commanding officer. And so I joined at the age of 18. It's a slightly obvious choice when you come from a line of naval people, but it's also slightly unimaginative. I can see in hindsight, perhaps I should have looked around a little bit more before I jumped. But there we are. That's the way it is. And I joined the CCF. I was in the cadets at school, which helped me, I guess, prepare for it. Although, in those days when you're young and you're sort of, you don't quite know what to do. It was quite challenging at times, the cadets. But I thought, no, I'm going to join the Navy, and kindly they offered to sponsor me through university, so I couldn't turn it down. And I've always had that love for the sea, the sailing and things like that. But yeah, when I look back in hindsight, there is an awful lot about keeping your options open and exploring more choices than perhaps I did. But yeah, I was pretty motivated. The Cold War was on. I came from a long line of naval officers, and it seemed the logical thing to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the choice thing, isn't it? I think you're right that it's good to look around, good to have a diverse set of views. But the reality is when I look at more and more people now, they end up landing in a world that they start off in quite quickly because, and that tends to then be very often where they spend a long period of time. It's interesting now when you look at youngsters today who are definitely doing something different. I mean, they are moving around with a more active plan to have different careers and shape that, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays for them in the long term. Was your father still actually in the Navy when you joined?
He was just. He retired a couple of years later. Sadly, he passed away before I took command on the frigate. So he came to sea with me in my small ship command, which is a moment of enormous pride for me. Yeah. But it is, you are surrounded by that maritime background, and actually it was quite formative. I think on Christmas days all of us children would be loaded in the car to go to the base so that he could go around and talk to the guards and the sentries and wish them all a happy Christmas. And we were sort of paraded round as the kids, which probably just irritated all the people on watch. But it was, for me, it was quite a lesson in just that human touch. And what a difference it makes when you show interest. And I know there are many, many examples from most people's careers of when they've actually sort of gone out to make that point to the people. But it is about people. And I look back and I learned quite a lot from him on just how to deal with people in a world which, of course, going back, 40 years ago, was much more rigid, much more hierarchical than it is today. The conversations we have today with our soldiers and sailors and airmen, fundamentally different. That relationship is totally changed from 40 years ago. And I look back, when you think, so I was born in the early 60s. It was, about 18 years after the Second World War and ended. And I was talking this week on Monday, I was doing an award ceremony for our students, and it was on 9/11. And I said to them, gosh, how many of you hadn't been born when 9/11 happened? These are students at university, and about 12 or 15 put their hands up. And so that sense of context, to me, 9/11 is just past. It's recent. Even the Falklands War doesn't seem that long ago. And yet, now I understand, looking back, why my parents kept talking about the Second World War, why it seemed so relevant to them. But as a child, to me, it was ancient history. It was Commando mags and old black and white films already by then. So that, I find myself, when I speak to the Emirati students, and I say I was here in 1988 in the tanker wars, I can see their eyes sort of glaze over. They weren't born, clearly, and they're trying to work out if their parents were born. when we first came to the UAE. So it is, that sense of context in our lives when we reflect on what's happened, what we think is enormously important and relevant and recent, and what they don't think is certainly they don't think it's recent, and they've never known any difference. I mean, you can look at technology, you can look at every area, but they have a fundamental different experience to us when we were their age.
No, totally so. And I think the history piece is, you're right. I mean, we're very much the same age, clearly. And the amount of times that's happened to me, particularly when I was working for Deloitte, which is a very, very young organization. I think the average age in Deloitte globally is in mid to late 20s, which is completely crazy. So, I was spoiling the average by some margin when I was there. And that happened to me all the time. You'd be talking about some sort of historical event and people would look at you like you were a dinosaur. You'd been around obviously so long, and how can you possibly remember that? Take you to the other end of it though. When you left the Navy, I mean, you mentioned obviously that you got an approach through LinkedIn for the job at Rabdan, and that was, I mean, obviously a seismic shift. You're leaving the Navy you've been in for a very long time. You're jumping out to go to a different country, different region of the world, into a completely different role, and obviously building on what you've done, I guess, a lot at the Defence Academy and the Staff College. But how did you find that transition, and how have you continued to find it in terms of a continuing success story for you?
Yeah, it was a tricky decision. I mean, I love the Navy. I had some great people I was working with. The job was very, very busy, but I was enjoying it. You still have hopes for moving on for further success. But on the other hand, I was in my very early 50s. It felt to me like new challenges were exciting, interesting. I also felt I spent an awful lot of time away from my wife. And I thought, this would be good. We could deploy together, as it were, and have a totally new direction. I think, a lot of people said, it's very brave. I don't think it's brave at all. I mean, the UAE is an incredible country to live in. It's very, very easy. Abu Dhabi is the safest city in the world. This is not what I'd define as brave at all. But you do end up leaving your comfort zone. And I think that that's not necessarily easy. But, of course, the flip side of that is that I spent quite a while thinking, well, if I don't do this, will I always regret not trying? Is it fear that's holding you back? And I thought, no, I'm going to resign. And actually interestingly, resignation actually means it's in your control. So you cannot blame anybody else for the decision. You definitely own your decision. And it's, you go and because of course you do your due diligence over where you're going to go to. But of course, there's always things you don't know when you arrive. There's always a vast amount to learn. And I think the necessity for a lot of humility is important. It's quite easy to come from having been the commandant of the Joint Services Command and Staff College thinking I know all about this. And of course, when I arrived, one of the things I immediately realized was that, the Joint Service Command and Staff College is a partnership agreement with King's College London and Cranfield, effectively. And therefore, my knowledge of academic process was very weak in comparison to my knowledge of how the military view education and training, staff training, and things like that. So I had plenty to learn, and that was part of the interest, and also joining a very mainly Emirati team, a lot of very high caliber young Emiratis working at the academy, but actually with a very diverse workforce as well. We have 38 nationalities on the staff, which probably makes us rather more multinational than NATO. It's a really interesting global, virtually all our faculty are PhD holders from top 200 universities in the world. So we've got a very talented faculty, a very talented set of Emirati staff, and recognizing that there's a lot you don't know. In fact, one of the pieces of advice I was given early on was don't make too much decision too quickly, because you will discover you didn't understand the situation in the first place. And therefore, listen, take advice, think about it before making decisions. And that was pretty good advice, I think, when moving to a field that you could come in with the great sort of, I was a senior officer in the British military. We're good at this stuff, and we are. but that doesn't mean that what you were good at in the UK is necessarily appropriate for the context and environment of where you're moving to. So I think that was a salutary lesson. But yeah, the transition was actually remarkably smooth. As I say, you come to a very well organized country. Everything is digital, everything's online, and the living is good. It's a great country to live in. So actually, there was not much bravery involved. And of course, you look back, and I think the interesting question is now looking back, am I pleased I did it? Did I make the right decision? And it's unequivocally yes. And I absolutely think now that had I not made the decision, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering why I didn't, why I wasn't prepared to try a new challenge and see whether it worked elsewhere. So I'm really pleased I did.
No, that's a really important point at the end there, I think, because I have exactly the same. I think, do I have any regrets? And people ask me that lots, particularly coming from the flying world, and do I miss it, and do I wish I was still doing it? And I've always said no, absolutely not. I wanted to leave with a smile on my face, a good view in the rearview mirror, and that's exactly what I achieved. And I'm so pleased that I went when I did and in the way I did, because it was, as you say, it's under your control if you're doing it that way. And I'm sure you're the same. I mean, I've seen too many people, particularly in the military, who have just clung on that bit too long, hoping for one more promotion, one more big job. And the same thing's true in the business world. I think if you're not careful, you end up disappointed and almost a bit bitter and twisted about what you had. And that's a real shame at the end of a long career, for sure. You touched on this a second ago, but I'd be really interested in a bit of a deeper dive in terms of leadership style, because you clearly went from a Navy that, when same sort of time as me, you joined the Navy, I joined the Air Force, but it was very hierarchical, it was very different, it was very male, the world was in a completely different place, to moving through a Navy that changed a lot, to then moving into a world where you're in a different country with a whole set of different cultures and a very academically minded, completely different world. How's your leadership style, your personal leadership style, adapted across the years to fit with all of that?
Yeah, isn't it fascinating when you look back? And I try and talk to the young cadet students about this, because I remember, I mentioned I was in the Combined Cadet Force, and I remember being put in a sort of, I think, what do we have, a petty officer's rank, I think, made to stand out front and take charge, and I really hated it. I mean, I felt I couldn't take charge, I couldn't lead, I couldn't do any of these things. It felt very awkward, and I look back on the journey from that young James to today, and I see the same challenge, of course, for the young students trying to build their confidence from, the teenage years, where sometimes you do feel a bit awkward. How do we help them on that journey? I mean, I think from my perspective, joining the Navy, going to Dartmouth gave me confidence, and I think obviously I needed to sort of grow up and have a bit of maturity to it. I learned an awful lot in those small ships as well early on. Strange enough, sailors will teach you if you're prepared to listen. And that relationship, that very close relationship, when you are literally all in the same boat, is a formative experience. And I discovered that actually I thoroughly enjoyed that whole relationship with the ship's company and the way we're doing. And then I think through that, you go on, and as you go up, and I enjoyed listening to your podcast with David Petraeus. You're talking about as you move up through the levels. Mine went from a very naval career to a joint career to a combined career, and now into sort of multinational, international sort of areas. And I think when I look through that journey, I think leadership, as you move off ships, which is one form, then into offices, where you're not all in the same boat, where you have a different sense of priorities and objectives. That was quite an interesting part of the journey just early on, going into the MOD, going into the permanent joint headquarters, and realizing that what was required was rather different. And I think, very much as everyone, you will have experienced the same thing, that, as your size of commands grow, clearly you have more delegation, less hands-on. But you're still very much there setting the tone, setting the vision. And yet, I was thinking about this question about detail, about how much detail you should go into, and thinking about, there are still points where I go really quite low into the detail. And because sometimes the devil is in the detail, and also because it sets a point, I think, that detail is important. Not that you personally as the leader have to go into it in depth, but you have to make sure that everyone knows that the detail is important. Otherwise, you will be undone, defeated in detail, effectively. So I think that's important. I think in the headquarters, towards the end of my military career, I noticed, you was so busy with meetings. I think it was very easy to lose sight of the people around you still needing leadership, still needing those conversations. And, I noticed that we went from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting with very full diaries. And by the time you actually got a moment to walk around the headquarters, I was chief of staff of the headquarters. So, one of my jobs was to go around and talk to people and find out what was worrying them and how we could deal with things. It was a real challenge, just making time. And I think I learned, a fair amount from that experience. At Rabdan, it's been very interesting because into a much more cross-cultural context with a significant proportion of the team being Emirati and then this very large multinational faculty and other wider staff. And that's been fascinating. I think one of the things I've really learned is about language. And it sounds so simple. And I'd never worked, as you heard from my introduction, I'd never worked in NATO. But I can see there must be similar challenges there. Because we speak in half sentences, in nuance, in jargon. We make very convoluted sentences which are almost impossible to interpret if you're not a native English speaker. And I learned an awful lot in the early days where I put words, I thought I was being really clever in my emails and realizing that actually I totally missed the point, that what I thought was clever was bewildering to everybody else. And therefore I was not communicating. We always count leadership as so much about communication. It's about you giving your vision and ideas and listening in return. And actually, if you fail to tell someone clearly what to do, it's your fault for using, poor English. And the amount of idiom I realized I used, just, phrases that if I only said even half of them, you would fill it in your head. I don't even have to finish the sentence. And you complete it in your head, know exactly what I mean. And I know you know what I mean. So I've often thought about the fact that I've understood every word that's been said to me, but I didn't understand what was meant by the words. And that meaning, what is it we're actually trying to communicate with each other? And I'm sure it must probably be true for every language, but we all have these very complicated ways of phrasing quite simple ideas. And so, both in the verbally, but also trying to follow up with clarity in an email or whatever, just to make sure that there's no doubt in the other person's mind what you want them to do. And also to give them a chance to read it 5 times, because, they listen to you once, you don't repeat yourself. So actually I found that, strange enough, things that require, formalize some things, write it down. And actually one of those things I've observed over the years, coming up from before PowerPoint to the days of PowerPoint, is that I do think that there's a massive sloppy thinking covered up by bullet points on PowerPoint slides. And it's strangely, when you have to write down what you actually mean in straightforward, simple English, it is so good to focus you on what is actually important, on setting a real clear vision. And I wonder how often in coalition partnerships or any international thing, we just fundamentally misunderstood each other because we haven't thought enough about what we're trying to communicate. So if there was one key lesson I've learned, clarity of communication. Probably don't need to say any more. I suspect we've all experienced it.
Yeah, there's so many great points. I think that language point's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I always laugh at it's a flippant comment, isn't it, when you talk about us in America, where it's 2 nations divided by a common language. And it's definitely true. I mean, I remember having a US American dictionary, which sounds ridiculous, but it was designed as a joke, but actually there were quite a lot of things in it that were relevant. And that's even more the case when you go into a multi-language environment. I do quite a lot of facilitation for Deloitte University, which is their big training establishment for EMEA. And so we have participants from all sorts of different nations across EMEA. And they're all very good. They're remarkably good at English. And I'm dreadfully envious because I'm really, I've got English and some German from when I was in Germany, but that's it. And I think it's dead easy, as you say, to be assuming people have understood but you've spoken quickly, you speak in phrases which, are not necessarily easily translatable or selectable from a dictionary, and it makes a huge difference if you've got clarity. And that's a really good point. Actually, it's a great idea about following up in writing, because particularly for people in that situation, it gives them time to absorb it and an ability to process it. No, that makes terrific sense. Thanks. Switching tack a bit and looking at role models. I mean, you talked about obviously your family and your father and your grandfather, which I guess were clearly significant influences. But other role models across your career, who's really kind of influenced and impressed you as you've gone through?
I mean, parents are obviously very deeply formative in many ways. I think there's so many lessons on, as I said, about the importance of visible leadership. I'm very interested in that concept that you have to be seen. Now, that's more difficult when you get into bigger organizations, but I've worked in various ships and organizations over my years, and the commanding officers who I admired most were the ones who really knew their ship's company. They were out and about. They could tell just over the voice reports in the operations room when people were stressed and under load, because they knew people well enough. And I think that always impressed me. I mean, I look at it and I think, well, there was probably no single individual who stood out as the role model, but I learned a lot from most of them. In fact, I learned a lot from all of the people I've worked for, some of it good and some of it bad. And a lot of different styles. And of course, one of the key takeaways I think you get immediately is that you have to be you. You have to be genuine. There's no point in trying to pretend to be a different leader to the one you are. I've worked for some quite eccentric people, and they were loved for their eccentricity. But if I tried to be eccentric, it wouldn't have worked at all. I've worked for some very, very straight people who were loved for being very straight and not being eccentric. It's fascinating to see that as long as you are genuine and honest to yourself, your style is your style. And hopefully, if you like people, if you like talking to people, you'll enjoy the relationship you have with the people who are working for you. I think when I look back over more senior leaders, I think the ones who've been able to show a clarity of vision and a succinctness have been really important to me. I remember when I went to PJHQ, and you'll remember there was like a weekly brief between the chiefs of staff in the Ministry of Defence and the Chief of Joint Operations and his team. And they'd done the long sort of briefing backs and forwards, and the Chief of Joint Operations hadn't said anything at all. And at the very end, they said, any more points from you? And he leant forward and he put his fingers up. He said, 2 points. And he made 2 very succinct, strategic points. And that was it. That's all he did. And I was slightly blown away by the clarity of his thought, the focus he put on the right issues, and the shortness of his intervention. And I remember thinking that is really good. As a strategic leader, to be able to ask the right questions, be succinct in your responses, and focus at the right level. I think when I look also, optimism and positivity, I think they're really, I've worked for some really optimistic. I think I've worked for probably one or two who I might describe as slightly naively optimistic. And there is a really interesting about, if you're too positive and too optimistic, it can also be unbelievable. So there's a credibility question. But of course, if you're not optimistic, no one's going to follow the leader who is promising ruin and damnation.
We're all doomed.
We're all doomed. Nobody's going to want to do that. So I think that's important. I think self-awareness is interesting. And I learned quite a lot in my role in the Middle East when I was working as in an Iraqi mission. I worked for a boss there who told me, he said that he snapped like a twig when he was tired. And he did. And he did snap like a twig. I remember a particular day where he'd just returned from a very long trip and was very tired. when I was given the unfortunate task of briefing him. He got very upset and he cleared the room to give me a personal bollocking, which of course I felt deeply was deeply unjustified. But he demonstrated exactly what he told me that he did, which is he snaps like a twig when he was tired. And I learned quite a lot of that because whilst it wasn't a pleasant experience, he did, for a start, he did clear the room. Whether I thought it was justified or not is probably was irrelevant to him. But at least he was aware of what he did. Of course, the downside of that is if you have that sort of behaviour, no one tells you anything for days because nobody wants to have their head chewed off unnecessarily. And there's a danger that you actually achieve the very opposite of the behaviours that you want. I've known commanding officers of ships who have tried to do everything, and if they arrived on the bridge in a certain set of circumstances, the first thing you do is you give a bollocking to the officer of the watch for not reporting something. Well, of course, the result you actually get is not the behaviour you want, which is more reports. What happens actually is the officer of the watch sees something and turns and goes the other way, so they don't get a bollocking. So you're not actually improving your operational effectiveness. You're driving a set of behaviours that actually undermine it by your very behaviours. So, that self-awareness question, if you know what you're like, you can try and protect yourself and your team from the bad side of your behaviours. I think it's very important. I think some of the US leaders you and I saw working in the Pentagon, I thought were very impressive. I think what struck me about it was the relationship between politics and military leadership, which seemed to me to have a maturity in the US system that was sometimes missing in the UK system. That relationship with the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, with the Hill, and those sort of maturity of political awareness and relationships, I think is really important. And I think there was a lot we could learn from how we should do that. And I think, when I look back over my time, I learned so much from the two ships I took over command when the commanding officers were removed before I took over. Just this straightforward sort of fairness, consistency, visibility, resilience. And I learned an awful lot from the slightly bitter experience at times of dealing with really awkward and broken teams, how you rebuild them.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. There's, on the one hand, it's always better to take over something that's got opportunity to improve it. I think if you alluded to this, taking over one ship where actually it was running smooth as clockwork, and it's harder than in some ways to maintain that. But I quite like the challenge of taking over something where there have been some challenges, but it depends how big the challenges are. And obviously, if you're in that situation, I don't envy you that. I think taking over people that have been kind of removed from command and you're now rebuilding, it's a bit like people who go into the interim business. In the commercial world, I think that's a really challenging world to operate in because they're almost inevitably they're there because something's gone wrong, and they're A, temporary, and B, having to patch stuff up in a way that is pretty tough as you go through. So, lots of great points in everything you've just said there. I think if I had £1 for everyone I've heard say my office door is always open, and then actually when you go and approach them to turn around and say, hey, can I just have a minute? No, not now, I'm really busy. Or an equivalent conversation, it's a really bad trait. I think the being approachable, being personable, doing the people thing is so important, and particularly as a senior leader. And it's so easy not to do it for all the reasons you mentioned: too many meetings, too much email, too many commitments.
The alignment of your words and your actions, which is what you've just said. We all do that initial address to the team when you arrive in command. And you say those sorts of things. I like loyal opposition, constructive input. I don't mind if you disagree with me. If the first time it happens, if you cut the person off, you will never get that behaviour ever again. If of course you say, well, that's a very good point, and you praise them, you will get more people trying to do what you've asked for. But this misalignment between words and actions is spotted immediately by the team who work for you. And it's the action that counts. It's not the words. You can say whatever you like to the team, pretty much. It's how you actually behave when you're in that command position. So, your example of my door's always open. Yeah, totally true. If you don't want it to be always open, don't say it is.
Yeah, and your actions undermine your words if you're not careful. If you say one thing and then do something else, then it's worse than having not said it in the first place, for sure. In my view, I think it's the real challenge. And the sort of subliminal behavior thing is the other one that I've always been very conscious of, that I've said it to a number of people where you'll be the same. You've been dealing at one stage with something really difficult in the office or in a location where people aren't aware of it. You're then walking down the corridor, meeting people who haven't seen you that day or perhaps haven't seen you at all for ages, but they know you're the boss. And your body language, demeanor, facial expression, everything counts. Because if you're not careful, you give an impression that is lasting to those people, and it's really, really important to be mindful of that as a leader. That you're always on parade, as it were. You're never in a position where you can just turn around and completely relax, because if you do, then often it's going to come home to bite you downstream in some way, shape, or form. Switching back to the other end again, just if you were looking back across whatever you're now 4 and a bit decades of working life, and you were advising school-age James on what he should or shouldn't be doing, what would you be saying to him?
Well, it's a great question, because my daughters are now in their sort of late 20s. And so actually I have been sort of trying to advise them, I guess, through school and stuff. And they'd laugh, because I always say to them, it's all about choices when you're at school. It's all about choices. What you want to do is make sure you have as many choices as you can possibly have. As many opportunities are open to you. It doesn't mean you have to follow them. But what you don't want to do is find that when you leave school or university, there's only one job you can do because you're not qualified for anything else. And so I would, there's strange enough, there's a lot about, actually it is worth getting decent grades. I mean, it sounds silly, but you can't get into a good university without decent grades. If you haven't got decent grades, if you haven't got a degree from a decent university, sometimes that's very constraining. A lot of companies are struggling now with that question about whether they should look at what degree you get. And some of them are changing their approach. But actually, these sorts of things, these qualifications open doors, or indeed not having them closes doors is perhaps a better way of looking at it. So to me, it's about making sure that you have choices when you go forward, and that you try things out. Experiences are really helpful. When people go to job interviews, and I only really ever did one job interview, well, two, one to join the Navy and one to come to Rabdan Academy. You need things to talk about, things that you've done. So volunteering, as a young man, I probably didn't do enough volunteering. I did lots of sailing, lots of sport, and lots of good things. But there's more I could have done to be more broad-minded, I suspect. I think we all self-constrain to an extent. Too often we don't try things when the opportunity is there, and we regret it later. I talked a bit about that in terms of coming to Rabdan Academy and coming to the UAE. But actually, young people often hide around the back, as it were. They don't volunteer themselves, and I think it's very important to push yourself forward. I mean, I as I say, I wasn't a very comfortable leader in the cadets, but being forced to do it, I learned so much from that. I discovered I could, and I think that's very important. I think curiosity. I mean, it's a slightly hackneyed thing to say now, because a lot of people talk about curiosity, but the ability to ask questions, the right questions, not just accept, and to try and see things slightly differently, to have your own view. I think, strange enough, things like traveling uncomfortably when you're young is quite important. You can be too comfortable, I think, in your youth. But, what other things? Learning languages. Actually, more than that, I did maths, physics, and chemistry and read an engineering degree because those are the things I was good at. And then I've arrived in a world where years later I discovered that language, history, geography, sociology, anthropology, almost all of those are actually the things that drive so much of behavior. That technology will be, to an extent, provided if you're not going into the technology business. But if you don't understand it, let's say in a military context, if you don't understand the character of the war you're fighting, it doesn't matter how good your technology is. And you can look at Afghanistan perhaps as a classic example where the Western coalition, NATO, had all the technologies, but we still ended up leaving with the tail between our legs. And I think a lot to do with not really ever comprehending the battle that we were fighting or the war we were fighting. And that's a bit harsh because some people did, to be fair. But I think, when you're young, you don't necessarily really see the importance of history and the like. And then years later, you realize that a lot of the behaviors you see around you are driven by historical, cultural, sociological issues. So I think if I was advising the young James now, I'd say, pay more attention to the non-science subjects instead of just writing them off. And language, because it's so closely linked to culture. I work in an environment now where virtually everyone is multilingual. Bilinguality is limited. Most people speak 3 or 4, sometimes 5 and 6 languages on the staff. And you suddenly realize there's another whole world in which language is enormously important. Maybe technology will remove that. Maybe we finally will get to a point where the translation systems work perfectly. But I still think, we'll come back to my point about communication, that it still won't pick up on nuance or idiom or slang. It certainly wouldn't understand the language that teenagers use. And then I guess one final thing on looking forward, I think thinking about family. Strangely enough, family are for life. Family are the bedrock of what you, I think, what you do in your life and career, your relationships with them, and of course, when you finish your career, they're the people there at the end as well. So, don't forget in all your ambition or your desire to succeed professionally, that you do also have another part of your life. And if they're out of balance, and we all have different balances, but if they're out of balance, then you will not be as good professionally. Is normally my sort of feeling on it, and particularly working in an environment here where quite a lot of people come unaccompanied. It's very important that because if you're distracted by family issues, you won't be very good at focusing on your work. So trying to get the whole thing in balance is really important.
Yeah, terrific set of points, and so much of which I completely recognise and agree with. I think your early point about not closing doors, with qualifications. That was one of the things. It's not just qualifications for me. It's don't close doors generally, just in relationships and things like that. I say it to people very regularly. If you don't need to shut the door on something, don't, because you never know when you're actually going to need to walk back through that. And if you burned the door on the way out, and made it much more difficult to get back through, then that's a hard place to be. Touched on some of this as we've gone through, but I'd like to kind of tackle it as a topic particularly. I think highs, lows, successes, failures, if you like. I mean, you've obviously had a real mixed bag of taking on jobs from people who have clearly failed in some way, shape or form and hence been removed. And you've equally been in the other spectrum. But what about personally for you? What's your career high point?
Well, it's strange. I think my career, in some ways, career low and high point came almost the same experience. I was in my early 30s and I'd been selected to command a frigate, and I'd been told I was going to one that was based in Portsmouth near my home, and it was a really well-run ship. I knew all the people. I couldn't have been more excited. I had a really good program, and then because they removed the commanding officer of another ship, I got a pierhead jump, as we would call it in the Navy, to be sent at 24 hours notice to a ship that was in pieces, effectively. So instead of the happy, close to home, family coming down to greet me on a Friday when we came back alongside, I was now, you're in a car tomorrow to go to a ship that's in the middle of preparations for workup, where the commanding officer's just been removed. We went into workup, we got a virus, we were quarantined for a week, we had an extended workup period, we had all sorts of challenges, and then deployed to the South Atlantic for a long period. And it was one of those things that was, looking back on it, I learned a vast amount from the experience. But at the time, it felt like so unfair that, this crowning moment, most warfare officers joining the Navy have one real ambition, certainly at the beginning of their careers, that's to command a frigate or a destroyer. And so when what you've set up as being this wonderful, perfect job that you're about to go and do, suddenly you end up with this, bag of broken pieces. It's not what you think it's going to be. And I remember a particularly tough, evening before going down to take command, talking to my wife about what was happening. Of course, she was disappointed because I was now going to be away a vast amount of the time. But she was trying to be excited for me as well, because of course it was a crowning moment of one of the crowning moments of your careers. So they all came together, and I look back because it was actually, in terms of my leadership journey, it was a real education. I mean, on many different levels. I particularly think, one thing I look in hindsight that I should have actually removed some of the people in the ship soon after arrival. And I come, from that sort of military side where, well, you're given the people to work for you who the system gives you. So that's the hand you've got. Those are the cards you've got. You can't ask to swap cards at this point. But of course, I could have done. I'd sort of seen it. This is the challenge: is to lead this slightly awkward situation. Actually, sometimes the best thing to do is to change the situation fundamentally by moving people on. And I think the road to recovery, when I look in hindsight, could have been quicker if I had moved some of the people early on. And I almost discovered it because when they left, they were replaced in the normal sort of cycle of appointments and postings. You suddenly thought, oh my God, this is much easier. Why was it so difficult before? And it's then you think, okay, I went wrong there. So I think for a leader, it's one of those tricky things is, we want to take along the weaker member of the team and make them and develop and build them up. But at what point do you say, actually, this is just never going to work? And for the good of the organization or the command or whatever it is, you've got to make a tough call and ask them to be replaced. And I look back on it and I learned so much from that. And it was a career high point in many ways. We had a successful deployment. It was, some really tricky lessons during it. But we got back in the ship. I actually handed over command of the ship and it went on. I felt I was handing over a really good ship by the time, and it went on and had lots of success. So, I can look back with pride, but my goodness me, but as a mixture of high and low point all rolled into one, it was great. And I certainly learned a vast amount from it. I think, coming on to, my time here as the president of Rabdan Academy, because it's like a startup university, reaching the point where we've tripled the staff, we've more than tripled the number of students, we've massively grown. We're into 15,000 short course students a year coming through. There's a real sense of excitement and interest in the academy and what it's doing. And I think that actually, I'm getting a lot of satisfaction and enjoyment working in this very diverse, multicultural team, working in a different environment to the one I'm used to. That always has its challenges as well. You know your own system very well. And when you move across to a different sort of organization, different structures, different ways of doing business, different hierarchies, there are inevitably things that you just don't know instinctively. Whereas, after 30 years in the military, you know the power chains, you know the way things work, you know how to influence, you know how to access. Of course, you come into a new world, and you probably felt the same moving across to Deloitte and moving into new organizations. Completely different power structures, totally different ways of doing business. Many similarities, many leadership things are much the same. They're still people you're dealing with. They're still clear vision. A lot of those traits that we like to see in leaders are still there. But I've learned a lot about. I think about having the humility to realize that I actually don't know an awful lot, and that I'm better off listening. And I think that is really important.
Yeah, great. Lots of really interesting stuff. I think one of my books that I really like actually is David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around. I don't know if you've read that. It's the US Submarine Command. And I think it's a really very instructive story about how he, similar to you, I think by the sounds of it, inherited a submarine that was not in a great place at all. And clearly turned it into one that was one of the best performing ones in the fleet and so on. And lots of great leadership that did that. But you make some really valid points there about sometimes you do have to take some hard decisions on particularly some of the people, and particularly if those people are loyal to the previous management, and that's a real challenge. So, yeah, and occasionally I think it's a human trait, isn't it? You try, because you're personally wanting to turn around and turn them around and get them to the right place, and B, because you don't really want you don't want to be making those tough decisions sometimes, because it's no, I don't need to do that. It'll be all right. We can work it through. And just occasionally, I've had the same thing where you think, no, I should have made that decision a bit earlier. That would have made life a bit easier in the way that I've actually done it. I think there's probably to be honest, there's a podcast all on its own about the actual nuts and bolts of that. I would love to, with a bit more time, have a conversation about how you actually did that. Because I think there's so many things in there that are really instructive in terms of going into an organization of whatever persuasion that is ultimately failing and turning it around to get it to the right place. And that's such a powerful thing to have done, and a tool set that it gives you. So a conversation for another day, maybe we'll store that up, put you back on my list. Looking at just before we move off kind of your personal leadership style and so on and into some other stuff, your work-life balance. I mean, you've come from a world which is very busy, often where you're on deployment on a ship, which is not exactly easy. Turn around and get out and do something completely different. I talked recently on a LinkedIn post actually about just take some time out, get out, go walk the dog and that sort of thing. If you don't have those kind of options, some of the time it must be a challenge. But how do you manage, not just then, but now, your work-life balance, and what sort of top tips would you offer to people?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important, isn't it? That work-life balance. And I think so much of it comes from a term I used to use, which was command energy. But it was about it was about your energy. It's simply that when you're drained, when you're tired, you transmit it to your team. I was well aware that if you got out of bed in the morning on a ship, if you were grumpy, the whole ship would be grumpy within about half an hour. It communicates itself. The first person you shout at shouts at 4 other people. And the next thing you know, everyone's shouting. And trying to see the same thing with energy. If you wake up with a spring in your step and a determination that today's going to be successful, we're going to be good, you everyone has that. They feed off your energy. And therefore, if you don't get your work-life balance right, if you're too stressed about things, then you will communicate that through your team, and it spreads like wildfire. I could feel myself at sea being drained, and I sometimes spotted I need to recharge. Occasionally people would drop you a hint as well. If you had a good team around you, they'd give you that hint that maybe it was time for you to perhaps go off and visit somebody. And strange enough, I actually find walking and talking is hugely re-energizing, because you realize that there's a whole organization working for you with full of individuals who are actually pretty passionate. And strange enough, their passion can re-feed what you're wanting. So I personally, even today, I spend a long time walking around talking to people. And it's not only good because you're visible, you're demonstrating leadership, you're finding out what's going on, but strange enough, I get energy from their enthusiasm. And I think that is really important. Beyond that, of course, everyone tries to keep fit, everyone goes to the gym, everyone does various things. It could be music, it could be books. It doesn't really matter, whatever is your personal thing. I mean, to me, family gives me a huge amount of recharge. I think it's their ability to stop you thinking about work. Strange enough, sports that stop you thinking about work and allow you to just distract your brain enough without exhausting you. Lying on the beach can be difficult because if you just lie on the beach, you have plenty of time to think and worry about problems. If you are, let's say, sailing or fishing or skiing, there's enough occupation in your mind to enable you to relax, but you can't think about two things at the same time. So on the whole, you probably can, but there's a constraint on some of us. And so actually I find that having that opportunity to be distracted from work enables you to recharge, because if you are just lying on the beach, you have too much time to think. And then you can start worrying about the things, and then you start your energy draining you down. And so I think it's very important. I think also leave, strange enough, leadership example, take your leave. Make it clear to people that you expect them to take their leave. We don't want to reach the situation where people feel that if they're not at their desks, they're clearly not doing their job. And, COVID obviously had an impact on this. Working from home has caused a great debate over this. But people do need a break. I try very hard not to interrupt people unless I have to after working hours. They should be able to go home and spend time with their children without constantly having to answer phone calls from you. And if you don't, you will drain them of their energy. So yeah, trying to find that balance It's a personal thing. I mean, some people are driven by work. It's where they get their energy from. Most of us, I think, have to find that balance.
Yeah, and the tone from the top thing that you touched on right at the beginning there in terms of the energy, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think if you're running the organisation and you have a sort of downbeat attitude and you're low on energy, etc., it does translate. But equally, your behaviour, the way you conduct yourself, whether you do take your leave, whether you do while you're on leave bother people or constantly answer emails and so on and so forth, I think really sends a message that's not always a good one. And so setting the right example as the leader is clearly really important to getting the behaviors you want your people to have. You've got to exhibit them yourself, because why, if you're not doing that, why would they do it? Fascinating. Really, really great points. I always on these sessions, I'm very conscious that I'm talking to people who have great vantage points, have been to the top of, in many instances, big organizations and are doing some really interesting stuff. You've come from a top end of the UK military, gone out to another part of the world where you have a different vantage point to look at the many and varied geopolitical challenges that the world is facing. I'd just be really interested in your perspective on what that looks like from where you are there, and the things that are top three topics, if you like, that are there and are real big concerns for the next, 10 to 15 years time frame that we're looking at. Really big challenges that the UAE is concerned about as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think you talked about vantage point, and that's really important. And like you, I've traveled a lot in my military career, and you think, I've operated in the Gulf and I spent quite a lot of time here, but you're operating in a military context, often living in military bases, working with military people on military issues. And it's not until you actually live in someone else's country that you begin, and I say begin, to get some understanding of how they feel from their country and of their perspective on your country and on all the rest of the world. So, I think people shouldn't mistake the difference between going somewhere on holiday and actually having any understanding about a place at all. And I think, I was blessed from my naval career that we did go to a lot of very challenging places. And it got me to think, at least, that I didn't understand why things worked the way they did. At least you knew you didn't know. Whereas I think there's a certain arrogance that people have that just because they've been somewhere means they understand it. But, I've lived here now with my wife for over 7 years. And despite having first been here in 1988, I didn't understand the country at all. The country is now just over 50 years old. And it has made, obviously, as everyone knows, some incredible progress in so many different areas. They are really ambitious for the future. And I find this is one of the starkest contrasts, is the sense of strategic vision, the strategic horizon, and the ambition that goes with it. A determination after 50 years of incredible development that the next 50 years will be just as ambitious and lead them to a new post-oil sort of environment. And I think that is really refreshing. At times when we live in Europe and other countries, we have lost that sense of a strategic vision of where we want to go as a country. And when you get it, you suddenly think, my word, this is a unifying idea. I think it was the big idea, David Petraeus called it in his podcast with you. He called it the big idea. The leaders should set a big idea. And there is big ideas here. And I think that is very, very interesting because it filters the whole way down through the government systems, through the ecosystems. And in a country that is 90% expats, only 10% of the population here is Emiratis.
Wow.
When you think about that, about how do you bring together a completely diverse society to a shared vision of a future where everyone is pulling in the same direction. And it's such a contrast to the discussions that go on the European side, I think. For perhaps understandable reasons, it's bound to be different because there's a different vantage point, a different perspective. But I think we need to, we often talk about it, wanting to have this ambition for where the country should go, the vision for where we should go, setting that sort of headmark that we can all see. And I think that's really important. Here there's a determination effectively to be the best country in the world. And it sounds a very simple, big idea, but actually it drives virtually everything from the smoothest immigration system in the world to the best policing in the world or the best whatever in the world. And it sets a sort of strategic aim point that, strange enough, can drive a lot of behaviors. I think if you live in the Middle East, it's not surprising that you look east at least as much as you look west. And whilst people will make judgments from, let's say, a UK perspective on decisions made, of course, nations act in their own interest. It's one of the truisms. And therefore, of course, the judgment and decisions made here are inevitably based on the UAE and where the UAE sits. When occasionally people say to me, "What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, if you were there making the decision, you would probably make the same decision, irrespective of the fact you don't live here. Therefore, you wouldn't make that decision from where you sit." And I think that ability to walk in somebody else's shoes for a short distance, to think about how they view the world, I think is really important. And it'll be really interesting. COP28 is coming up here later in this autumn, and the UAE has the lead for COP28. And I think when I look at what's been done here as part of that journey of trying to improve the environment, of trying to see how the post-oil world works, and how you link that through business to make sure that the business model supports the transition, I think that is a hugely important issue, because if you can align the economics with the sort of environmental and all of those other ideas, if you can align it, you might actually get the change you want, rather than the change just people demand, but with no plan to get there. So I think it's incredibly interesting country to live in here, and it's been a privilege. But it's partly this bringing together the whole of society to try and pull in the same direction, and how you do that as a leader at that truly strategic societal level is something that we probably don't think enough about from a European perspective. We've got so much concrete poured already. We find it difficult at times to break ourselves free of the frameworks we built around ourselves, the boundaries we put up, the walls we built, to try and see a different, potentially a different world in the future. And I think, if there's one that's really opened my eyes living here rather than just visiting, it's been that sense of, strategic ambition. Where do we want to be in 50 years' time?
No, it's a great answer. It's fascinating as well. I knew there were a lot of expats there, but I didn't have any idea it was 90%. That's amazing. The last but one question is about, you've probably touched on a couple of these things, but I'm interested in getting a single one from you. What's the most memorable event of your career so far?
The single most memorable, that is quite tricky. There have been many outstanding moments at sea, ashore, with great people. Memorable events is actually a lot of the people you work with, I think, make the difference. There have been some fabulous sunrise over the glacier at the bottom of South Georgia, with 10,000 king penguins porpoising out past the grounded icebergs. I have a photograph somewhere of it. It will remain in my mind as one of the most awe-inspiring moments of my career. But I suppose I should say, truly, I guess at the end of the career, standing in front of Her Majesty the Queen, receiving the Companion of the Order of the Bath, was an unbelievable honour. And really, of course, as we all say, but actually, I genuinely mean, was a reflection of a vast amount of hard work by a lot of other people. I was just the one lucky enough to be in the leadership position to get the credit for it. But that was truly amazing. She asked me how her ship was getting on. I'm not sure if I meant to share what Her Majesty asked you. And for a moment, I thought they were all your ships, and I was trying to work out what she meant. And then I realised she was talking about the aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth. She was asking how Queen Elizabeth was getting on, and I was pleased to sort of report to her that all was going well. And she came up with this broad, beaming smile as she did, and felt very privileged to be standing there in front of her.
Yeah, that would be a great moment, no question. That's a very memorable event. the Still Your Ships thing amuses me because ages ago I was in a bar actually at Shrivenham, where your old stamping ground, talking to Lord Stirrup when he was still Chief of Defence Staff, and he'd been my squadron commander years before when I was out in Germany, and I was chatting in a group, and he was there, and I was introducing somebody to him, and I said, CDS used to be my boss, and he looked at me, he said, "I still am your boss, Bob." That was a really great moment. He was just completely right. I just didn't think about it in that context. The very last question then, James. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
I think the most difficult questions are the ones we ask ourselves. We've all done that media course where you learn to block and you bridge across. So if you don't like the question, you can just block your way past it and go to a question you do like. And that's fine if someone else is asking you. But the strange ones are the ones that are inside your own head. In fact, you talked a bit about imposter syndrome, I think, in one of your earlier podcasts. And I reckon the vast majority of people must have some form of imposter syndrome, must ask themselves difficult questions. The ones that keep you awake at night, or that you wake up thinking, dear, what am I going to do about this, that, or the other? Have I got this decision right? And those are much more difficult because you can't sort of block and bridge a question in your own mind. And I think it's a hugely important part of ourselves that we do ask those questions of ourselves. I'd almost be more worried about the people who don't have any imposter syndrome, the people who genuinely believe they are absolutely brilliant at everything, should have been selected sooner for the job, because it probably means they don't understand the situation that they're facing, the complexities and the challenges, and it would have such an arrogance to it that it would be very worrying to me. So, the most difficult question, I think, are the ones that I find rattling around my head, which I find difficult to answer in a way that I could probably answer any other question, even if I just didn't answer the question. The ones in your own head, they're the most difficult ones.
James, a fascinating conversation. I knew it would be a really interesting conversation, not least because of your great career and particularly with what you're doing now, because I think you're in a really interesting part of the world doing a job with a really interesting institution, and in the context of a kind of leadership discussion, that's immensely helpful. So I'm extremely grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. So many great points. It's been fantastic.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thanks for asking me to come and chat with you. I thoroughly enjoyed it as well. It's nice to reflect, actually, at times on what we've done in the past. And thanks for the whole series of podcasts, because I think those first three in which you talk very personally about your own journey are also very insightful for all of us. And I'm looking forward to listening to some of the other ones as they come out. So thank you very much.
No, thanks for that. Much appreciated. No, the reflection thing is interesting, isn't it? I find that as I actually run the podcast and host it, that what I pick up, I've been surprised. I've been surprised about some of the stuff I've bizarrely on some of the things on my own ones, on my solo ones, but also actually on the ones that I get from interviews, where I always get a huge amount from what people have to say, because they've just got so many fascinating stories as well. No, super. Thanks, James. Appreciate it.